All right, AP Hug. We are shifting over here into the world of religion and its connection into culture. We covered some of this in class, so I'll move through some of this quickly. Being where we hit it, we got kind of our basic definition of what religion is all about. And then we focused on the differences between universalizing religion, which again is one that's always trying to attract more people to join those different religions, faiths, and then ethnic religions that aren't opposed to other people becoming part of their religion, but don't really go out of their way to attract other people. And so a lot of times they might be a little bit more exclusive, like it says. Sometimes religions that are connected to one ethnic group or one geographic place, more associated with one ethnicity, that kind of an idea. All right. And then we also took a look at secularism, which is kind of removing religious aspects away from forms of like government, things like that. And so it's really, it talks about their kind of stepping away from formalized religion. It's not necessarily, yeah, in most cases, secularism isn't anti-religious, although it could be lumped in there with it. But it's, like we talked about, even like our U.S. form of government, which makes a deliberate attempt to be secular so as not to favor one religion over others. And then we also looked at theocracy there, which is where you blend government and religion together, and talked about that example of Iran in the Middle East being a theocracy. All right, so from there we'll shift over to how religions tend to be organized, and start off with branches. Okay, and so that's where you look at a major religion, and look at how it's broken down into kind of like little subparts. And so when we think about like Christianity, okay, as a big picture religious faith. And within Christianity, there's Catholicism, right? Kind of like what our school based around. Protestantism is another branch of Christianity. Eastern Orthodox, that is very practiced in a lot of either Russia or Eastern European countries. Also, is a branch of Christianity. Okay, and then within Islam, I've got Sunni and Shia. Within the Islamic faith, there's a couple of branches. Although some people get into debate about this: is it a branch? Is it a sect? But Sunnis and Shias are all Muslims, but who have some distinct differences when it comes to who they believe should be considered to be the leader of the Islamic faith. Kind of like, not necessarily like the equivalent to a pope, but Shias tend to think that whoever leads the Islamic faith, who's seen as kind of like the main kind of the person who's the leader of the faith, that they need to have some kind of ancestral connection back to Muhammad, who was the prophet who founded Islam. And Sunnis don't have that belief. They kind of tend to go with whoever wants to lead and can get people to follow him. There's your leader. It doesn't have to have, it doesn't have to be able to show some kind of ancestry to be able to do that. So you get those kinds of things going on. Okay, so yeah, divisions within a religion doesn't mean that they're divisions that result in conflict, although sometimes it does happen. Even you look at a country like Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants have been in conflict for many years. You go back into world history; there were wars fought in Europe back in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and an aspect of those wars were Catholics and Protestants fighting against each other over which religion was going to be the most dominant one in Europe. So those kinds of things. Okay. Denominations, that's where you can start kind of breaking religions down even finer. So like within the Catholic faith, there are what are called Coptic Catholics, Roman Catholics, Eastern Catholics, Armenian Catholics. Those are all like denominations within the Catholic branch, okay, of Christianity, is the way you'd kind of describe that. Protestants, which I think there's more Protestants in the United States probably than Catholics, and so some of those denominations within the Protestant faith are Anglicans, Lutherans, Calvinists, are all denominations of the Protestant faith. Okay, again, another branch of Christianity. So that kind of gets into to that idea. So it's just this idea of how religion kind of breaks down, and with as we go from branches to denominations, and now down there to number 3 to sects, they're getting smaller and smaller, and so. Within Christianity, if I'm going to use that one as kind of some examples for sects, if you've heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses, all right, there you go. That is a sect. It's a much smaller group, and within the United States, probably compared to Protestantism or Catholicism. Much, much, much smaller. If you've ever heard of the Church of Scientology, that would be another sect. Okay, some people will tell you, "Oh, it's kind of like a cult," but we won't go down that far. Okay, technically speaking, we could describe it as a sect. Some people, like I said, if I go back to that Sunni versus Shia up there, some people say that that's kind of getting into that area. I don't know. That's a debate I'm not going to jump into. But even within the Catholic religion, there are some groups of Catholics. There's a sect within the Catholic Church that are called the Old Catholics, that take a very, very kind of old-fashioned, very, very kind of narrow, maybe a little more conservative view to how the religion should be practiced. And then on the opposite end of that, there are what people who call themselves liberal Catholics, and there is a liberal Catholic Church that takes a much more kind of a modernized view to that kind of thing. There's the African Orthodox Catholic Church. So, again, smaller groups that we would describe as sects, okay, within these religions. So think of that, branches, denominations, and sects. All right down the line, just like so. All right, basis of worship. What we're talking about with here is kind of how kind of different ways that religions can end up being practiced. And I'll start you off with a couple of really, really basic ones. And this is probably terminology most of you are somewhat familiar with. So polytheism is any kind of religious faith that has more than one god or goddess. Sometimes just might be 2 or 3. Sometimes it might be a whole cast of characters. Hinduism is described as being polytheistic. Shintoism, which comes from Japan, Taoism, the Wiccan faith, and some people would kind of almost like witchcraft. All of those polytheism. If you go back into history, the Romans, the Greeks, their kind of faith revolved around all their gods and goddesses. That's all examples, excuse me, of polytheism. Okay, and then when you get down to worshiping just one god, boom, we go from poly to mono, right? And yes, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Sikhism, there's a number, and most of the major religions in the world are monotheistic. You don't bump into too many nowadays. Again, I gave you some examples there with number 1, and I'm not minimizing. Those are religions that have millions of followers, and so again, it's still something that is out there, but the majority of the world is monotheistic and does worship, whether it's Allah, whether it's the Christian concept of God, that kind of a thing. Okay, if we go back in history for basis of worship, the further on back we go, and some would even suggest that going back to the days of kind of hunters and gatherers, back I'm not going to talk about like cavemen, but some of the earlier forms of humanity. Some of the first forms of religion are where we get to that concept of animism. And it goes back to really ancient times when a lot of times peoples may have been worshiping kind of like parts of the natural world. Okay, I mean, that's where animism comes from. It comes from animals. And in some civilizations, we believe that, we can, and we have evidence of this, whether it's cave paintings and things like that, that some people worshipped animals that were critical to their survival, animals that they hunted and consumed, that kind of a thing, right? And so, over time they begin to see that, that these animals have some kind of like, talks about their divine spirit connected to them. And so my mention there about, more frequency among indigenous people. As time went on and you started to see more of kind of organized religion move into usage, you still saw animism cling a little later on through history amongst, indigenous people. Who still lived a life that was a little bit closer to the land, might be less developed than, kind of more modern industrialized countries, that kind of thing. There is still some animism that exists out there. Again, at this point in time where we're talking about maybe, some aspects of native religions in the Americas, in some parts of Africa, some parts of East and Southeast Asia. There's still a little bit of that still exists, okay? But in many parts of the world, animism has been transplaced by either forms of monotheism or polytheism, okay? And then the last one I have there for that, again, that basis of worship is shamanism. And this is usually also another one that has very, very old, kind of ancient roots, kind of like animism. And a lot of times revolves around this shaman individual who oftentimes is going to be a leader within, it might be however you're going to describe a tribe, a civilization, whatever the grouping of people is. And these are usually people that are viewed as having, not only being viewed as kind of like a faith leader, but people who have the power to heal the sick, people who have the power to be able to communicate with the dead, those kinds of things. And so, number 3 and number 4, again, not saying that none of it exists anymore, because there is still some of it out there, but they definitely tend to be more on the minority when we look at the whole, scope of the world and different bases of worship. Okay, so that will cover us there. And then here we'll get kind of a focused in on where religion kind of collides in with culture, and then ethnicity, and then even getting the concept of nationality right into the mix, because there is linkage that goes into all of this. Probably this would be a good place. Well, let's see. Do I want to talk about that now? Yeah, maybe I'll hold off on it. Never mind. Cancel that out. All right. Hey, hold on. I'm gonna have another coughing fit. Just a sec. All right. Sorry about that. Let me just get that all cleared out. So with ethnicity and nationality, let's jump into here. So first of all, kind of giving you a little bit of a working definition of what ethnicity means, term that gets thrown around a lot. And so you've got some kind of the definition there that talks about shared language, shared customs, so it might be like, holidays and kind of some rituals, things like that. Shared history is important because it just means that, we're talking about a group of people that can kind of trace a history that goes back in time. So it's things that kind of binds people together, just like the customs, just like language. And then religion gets thrown into the mix as well. Okay. And these are all kind of aspects that make people feel like they are part of a group. They have that membership in a group. And, we'll see where ethnicity ends up playing that role in bringing large groups of people together to have those feelings of what we call nationalism, where we feel like we're part of, of a country. It's kind of like, we every morning in chapel, after our opening prayer, we turn to the flag and we do the pledge. And that pledge is basically vocalizing nationalism. We're allegiance to the flag. It's representation to our country, and we do that together. And that's kind of one of those, kind of aspects of ethnicity and nationalism. There's some concepts we'll get into again in Unit 4. All right. but a little bit what we're talking about there with A. All right. And well, there you go. There's the term. Again, sometimes Mr. Floyd gets just a little ahead of himself. And so that term nationality, nationalism, is those levels of connections that you have to a country. All right. In some places it can be very, very strong, where people feel a real deep love and patriotism, and other places it's a little bit less of a real strong emotional connection. But whichever way you're looking at it, that connection to a country, nationality. Okay. Spatial dimensions. Now, here's where we're going to talk about a couple things, including the big exception to one of the rules that we've kind of talked about before. Let me jump into this. So, religions, just like a lot of culture, start with what we call, a cultural hearth, or by Mr. Sin, hearth, whatever. We think of like Judaism. All right, cultural hearth of Judaism is going to be modern day Israel, right? Going back to Canaan and kind of where that religion originally gets started. We look at Islam, and we look to Saudi Arabia and areas like Mecca, where and gets in the area where that faith begins. Okay, and then we can even break it down even further. We can talk about like in Iran, not only are they Muslim, but they're Shia Muslims. That's again the part of the faith where they believe that the leader should be connected back to Muhammad. So boom, cultural hearth of Shia of Islam. All right, is going to be in Iran. So it's that kind of idea that follows along very closely with pretty much the rest of culture. When we talk about those cultural hearts, whether it's music or fashion or all the different kinds of examples it can be. What I want to throw in here, and you can make sure you left column this, okay? I probably should just include it in the notes, but hey, shame on me. And that is this idea that, we've talked about distance decay, and the fact that, from the hearth, it's going to be really, really strong. And then the further in distance you go from there, it's going to get weaker and weaker and weaker, okay? And we can talk about that in a whole lot of different aspects when it comes to culture. Maybe the kinds of foods that people eat in one culture, and then the further you get away from there, you're going to find fewer people that are seeking out those kinds of foods. I mean, there's a lot of things like that we can look at. Traditions, and and we can also look at it in some aspects of language as well. When it comes to religion is the exception to the rule. Okay, doesn't matter. When a religion is different than everything else, it does not matter how far people travel away from home, whatever home may be. They keep their religion. Right? When people migrate from one place to another, we talked about that, acculturation. They're going to shed some aspects of their culture, and then they're going to acquire, some of the aspects of the place that they are moving to. I'll tell you, one of the things they don't shed is their faith. Okay, that is strong. And I'm not saying it never ever happens. Yes, sometimes some people will convert, but that is the exception to the rule. So whenever we're talking about the concept of distance decay, it works for a lot of different aspects. It doesn't work for religion, okay, by and large, right? That's what we're talking about there. And then when we talk about that movement explains story of group, predicts future, things like that, best example I can give you of that is when we study the diffusion of Islam. Islam is, whichever way you want to slice it, dice it, is the fastest growing religion since it was introduced back in about 600. 600, and that would be what? In the Common Era, or AD, after death, whichever way you want to go with that. It's the newest of the major religions. Christianity is older than Islam. Judaism definitely older than Islam. But looking at the way that Islam has grown since 600, it's pretty much predicted that by about 2050 there will be as many Muslims around the world as there are Christians. And then if that growth continues in its current pace, by about 2070, it's expected that Islam will be the most practiced religion globally. Right? Christianity still is hanging on by kind of a slender thread in 2025. But in the next about 50 years, that's expected to flip. And we can just kind of tell by the way that Islam has continued to spread, starting from the Middle East and then, going north, south, east, west from there. And there is, not a continent left on the planet that does not have that kind of, that evidence of the spread of Islam. Okay. And getting down here to the bitter end, which is a good thing because we're over 20 minutes. And that will be number 3 here. All right. So variations by place and religion. So what are we talking about that? Well, just that, there are lots of little changes, differences, variations that occur within religion. So, if we think about another denomination within Christianity is Baptists, all right? It's and we think about where most Baptists geographically here in the United States are located, and you're going to definitely find far more Baptist Christians down in the South. Okay, even though we are, sitting here in the Pacific Northwest in a Catholic school, still the highest concentration of Catholics in the United States is in the New England region, back over on the East Coast. So kind of Massachusetts and Connecticut, in Rhode Island, and through that area. And so sometimes you're going to have those variations that are geographic, and that you can see higher density in terms of whether it's a branch or a denomination or a sect that might be driven by geography. And a lot of that just goes back to history and how a faith has spread over time, how it is diffused. Okay, let's see, for B, fundamentalism, where we can talk about here. Is one of those variations. And what I mean by that is that as we look at the way that any kind of a faith is practiced, I got an example over on the right side there from Christianity, and then over on the left side from Islam. Fundamentalism. It's something that ends up being featured in pretty much every religion that you find. And it is, well, you got your definition right there. And that is literally, most of these religions, Christianity has the Bible, Judaism has the Torah, the Quran for the Muslim faith. And, people have over time have interpreted those texts differently. And a lot of times they've kind of changed things as time has changed and technology has changed and the way people have lived their lives have changed. But when you pretty much just push all that to the side and say, no, you have to live your life strictly, word for word, by the way that faith is described in these texts, that's where you get to that concept of fundamentalism. Okay. And, some of the examples of fundamentalism gone wrong in our own history, that picture I have over there on the right side, if you don't recognize that is the Salem witch trials that took place in the 1690s in at that time, the English colonies, when there was this witch scare, hysteria that took place, mainly in the New England colonies. And a bunch of people, especially women, poor women that were kind of on the edge of society, were accused of witchcraft. Many of them condemned to death, and many of them were executed, okay, along with a few men that got thrown into the mix. That was, this strict reading of the Bible that was so fundamentalist that it pretty much kind of lost sight of reality. And eventually people kind of it's like, what are we doing here? And, things kind of got back to where they needed to be. And now we look back at those witch trials as just, almost like an example of, you don't ever let religion go to this kind of a level where you're condemning people and, and executing people based on faith. Europe saw some of these kinds of things happen in older times as well. Okay. My example over there with Islam is, we think about some of the terrorism that has plagued the world in the last 20, 30 years. The 9/11 attacks, those are carried out by Muslims who take a very, very fundamentalist, very strict view of the Quran and view people who don't practice the faith of Islam as, what they call infidels. Basically people who, in their eyes, are more or less not worthy of life, right? One thing to keep in mind with fundamentalism is it tends to be very, very small minorities of whatever faith we're talking about, whether it's Christians, Muslims. The vast majority of the people who practice those faiths have a much more just kind of a, what I'd consider to be a little bit more of a flexible view of their faith and how their faith fits in with day-to-day life and living in the modern world and, those kinds of things. But there's very few faiths that don't have incidents, and people who take a much more fundamentalist view of how the faith should be practiced. Okay. And then I guess, an exception to the exception to the exception, after I talked to you about the fact that religion itself is resistant to distance decay, we definitely seem to see more fundamentalism, usually closer to the hearth, okay, of a religion. And so, when we talk about some of those extreme examples coming from the Islamic world, most of them come directly from the Middle East. Although, at the same time, I'm not going to say that that's like a hard and fast rule, because sometimes we hear about people who have been radicalized. And those can be Christians, those can be Muslims. And typically those are people who have been, living lives that didn't really seem anything out of the ordinary, but then get drawn into a more fundamentalist view of their faith that becomes more and more and more extreme until they are at a place where they're willing to carry out violence, what they see as in the name of their faith. Okay. And again, we see examples of that in a lot of different religions. No one religion has the monopoly on that. But as a general rule, we do tend to see that fundamentalism become less of an issue the further away you get from the original hearth of the faith itself. All right. Let's see. And is there anything else I want to get in with all of that? I think that will pretty much cover it. And so, voila, all right? And got that all taken care of in less than half an hour. Who knows if we would have been able to do this in half an hour in class, for it would have taken the whole class period. I don't know what to tell you. But that will cover as far as what I need to hit with the notes. You guys will definitely bump into a little bit more on religion when you tackle this in Chapter 8. Our last chapter that we're dealing with, we'll cover some religion. And so, altogether, that should give us everything that we need to keep our friends at the College Board happy and this aspect of Unit 3, all right? And with that, there you go. You got it. You got culture, how culture spreads. You've got language aspects, and now you've got religion. You're done with another unit. Only 4 more left to go. Oh boy. All right, that'll do it. And well, take care.